Awesome. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining tonight's parent webinar on grief and loss. While this is a challenging topic, it's one that deeply impacts many of us and deserves thoughtful discussion. To those of you personally experiencing grief right now, please know that we acknowledge your journey and we are here to support you. I'm really excited to introduce our guest speaker, Erin Blechman, an author, speaker, and certified grief educator. Erin brings both professional expertise and profound personal insight to this conversation, having lost her son Max to suicide following his battle with mental illness. Through her work, she strives to create open, honest dialogue around grief, loss, mental illness, and suicide. Over the next hour, Erin will share valuable perspectives to help us better understand and navigate this difficult subject. During the presentation, all participants will remain muted. However, we encourage you to share your thoughts and questions in the chat box or Q&A box. So feel free to use either, whichever one you prefer. You should see it at the bottom of the screen. Feel free, if you'd like, to put your name in the chat box now. And what's your favorite ice cream flavor? That'd be a fun way to kick us off. So we can see here, let's see if I can pull this chat up. Anyone would like to share? Q&A. Okay. Well, if you'd like, feel free to put any thoughts or comments while the webinar is in session, and I'll make sure I monitor that. And while this workshop is educational in nature, please note this is not intended as therapy, and Erin's role is as an educator rather than a mental health counselor. So Erin, thank you again for spending your time with us this evening, and feel free to take it from here.
All right. Thank you, Maggie. I'm really honored and glad to be here. And you guys are leaving us hanging. We don't know who's here. We just see participants, and then we see a number above it, but nobody has entered their name or their favorite ice cream in the chat. So
ooh, okay, somebody did, Erin. So it looks like Tracy is here, and her favorite flavor is Moose Track. Oh, that's a good one.
Oh, Tracy, that's a good one.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I'm going to share my screen.
Okay.
And, as Maggie said, feel free to comment on a particular slide. If a particular slide causes you to form a question, make sure that you write that in the chat or the Q&A, because we will be doing a Q&A at the end of the presentation. Okay. So on June 3rd, 2020, my husband Bill and I got the worst news that parents can ever receive. And that was that sometime during the night before, our eldest son Max had taken his life. We got a call at about 8:15 in the morning. I was still in bed. Bill actually took the call downstairs. And as I was in bed, I heard him crashing up the stairs. And I heard him, before he even opened the bedroom door, screaming, "He's gone. Max is gone." And I remember the thought that went through my head was, gone where? Because when you are experiencing an intense trauma, a traumatic situation, often the thoughts that pop into your head are not logical or reasonable. So over the next few hours on that morning, we began the daunting task of calling family and friends to tell them that we had lost Max. And we started every conversation with, "We lost Max," as if we could find him again if we tried. And it was looking back, I don't know how we made those calls. We were numb. We were really operating on autopilot. And I have since learned that that is a protective mechanism in our brains. Our brains will not allow us to absorb everything all at once. It just lets in bits and pieces. And so that was really a protective mechanism that was allowing us to do the things that we needed to do in those hours and days and weeks following his death. So, we had to write his obituary, we had to plan his visitation and his funeral, all very daunting tasks for parents. But one of the things that I'm very thankful about is that we were upfront about the way that Max died. We were upfront that we had lost him to suicide. And I'm very grateful for that because there was never any secrecy. And it has allowed us to talk openly, both immediately and in the 4.5 years since he's been gone, about his mental illness that ultimately led to his suicide. And so I'm going to share some of the things that I've learned with you tonight over these last few years. But first, I want to help you to get to know my boy. So this is my Max. As you can see, he was a beautiful baby and a beautiful little boy. And he was, from a very young age, he was quirky, he was inquisitive, he was very bright. He started speaking in full sentences at 15 months. He read his first Harry Potter book between kindergarten and first grade. He was just really a brilliant guy. And as he got older, his creativity expanded into things like writing. He wrote poetry and songs and short stories. He wrote his own material for his stand-up comic act. He was a musician. He learned how to play the drums and the banjo. He sketched. He was just an incredibly creative and interesting guy. But my favorite thing about my Max was his sensitive and tender heart. He just was always looking out for others and always looking for ways to help. And that makes me immensely proud to be his mom. This is the last picture taken of our family. This was taken Mother's Day of 2020. And it was the last time the four of us were together. And if I had known that, I think I would have held on to him a little bit tighter that day because we were never together again. This is my favorite picture of Max and I. This was from the vow renewal that my husband Bill and I did in the summer of 2017. And we asked both of our boys, Max and Sam, to be a part of that day. And so we asked Max to give us a toast. And as a comic, he had a kind of snarky, witty sense of humor. So we were expecting a little more of a roast than a toast. But our boy gave us the most beautiful tribute. And I'm so grateful that I have his printed words and I have a video of him giving that toast. And those are just really precious gifts. I would be remiss if I didn't introduce you to Emmy Lou. Emmy Lou was Max's dog, and he adopted her in the fall of 2016. And we now have sole custody of Emmy, and we just love her. She was a therapy dog of sorts for him. She's incredibly loving and intuitive and loyal and sweet. And she's like a therapy dog for us as well. And she's like having a little piece of Max. So that's really special. So now I want to get into what I've learned about mental health because Max struggled for 8 years with his depression and his anxiety. He was diagnosed at the age of 19 with major depressive disorder, and he struggled with it for the next 6.5, 7 years. And so, of course, we struggled with him, but I didn't understand his mental illness while he was alive because I was mostly afraid of it. And so I want to share some of the lessons I've learned, some of the things that I've learned in the hopes that it can help someone else. So the first one is that depression is so misunderstood. Oftentimes when we would tell people that Max was struggling with depression, the response we got from others was, what does he have to be depressed about? And that just goes to show how misunderstood depression is. It is not feeling blue. It is not a passing mood. It's not a behavioral problem. It's not a character flaw. It's an illness. And unfortunately, we in our society don't always treat it as such. The other thing I've learned is the opposite of depression is not happiness, it's motivation. And so when Max would be having a major depressive episode, he would struggle to get out of bed. And it wasn't that he didn't want to get out of bed. It was that he literally couldn't. He couldn't summon the motivation and the energy to do it. And that's what depression does. It often saps a person of the motivation to do even the most basic things. And again, that's a reason that it's misunderstood, is a lot of people equate depression as the opposite of happiness, and that's not the case. Finding medication to treat depression is like trying on shoes without knowing your size. Actually, this was something that a doctor told us when Max was searching for an antidepressant that would be effective for him, and he never did. He had to try umpteen antidepressants through the 6 or 7 years that he was struggling with his depression. And he had it was a medication resistant form of depression. So nothing worked. When we went to try to clean out his room after he passed, there was an entire garbage bag of medications that he had tried that hadn't worked. And the thing that's important to understand about an antidepressant is it's not like an Advil. It's not like you take an antidepressant because you're depressed and your depression goes away. It takes time for the antidepressant to get to a therapeutic level in your bloodstream. And then you have to see if it's going to be effective. And if it's not, then you have to titrate off of it to try something else. So, that whole process can take a couple of months and can be very frustrating if the medication that you're trying isn't working. Then you're kind of starting from square one. I already said this, depression is a disease, and it's a disease like diabetes or heart disease. And again, we often treat it so very differently, and that really needs to change. I love this chart, and if you'll bear with me, I'm going to read through it because I think it so clearly illustrates how we treat mental illness and physical illness differently. So in mental illness, the person gets blamed. In physical illness, they get cared for. In mental illness, the person is told to get over it. In physical illness, they're told you'll be supported through it. With mental illness, a person is told take responsibility for your problems. With the physical illness, they're told ask for help anytime. With mental illness, the person is criticized for being weak and lazy. And with physical illness, they're praised for being strong and courageous. With mental illness, the person is told, stop being so self-indulgent. With a physical illness, they're told, it's a hard road, be kind to yourself. With mental illness, the person is told, it's a choice. With physical illness, they're told, there's nothing you could have done to avoid this. So the lack of compassion, oftentimes, that a person who is experiencing a mental illness receives it's just heartbreaking. And we know this firsthand because Max also had a physical illness. He also struggled with epilepsy. And when we would tell people about his epilepsy diagnosis versus his depression and anxiety diagnosis, we got a completely different response. Again, people were much more understanding and empathetic about the physical illness versus the mental illness. And that's something that really needs to change. So mental illness is often demonized and criminalized. When a person is experiencing a mental health crisis and a 911 call is made, the people that are dispatched to that scene are police officers. And so not a medical professional, not a crisis counselor, not a therapist, not a medical professional of any kind, just a police officer or police officers. And, unfortunately, they often don't have the training that they need. And sometimes situations escalate and the person suffering the mental health crisis can be injured or even killed. And, Max was acutely aware of this when he was alive. He never had to have a 911 call made on him, but, he followed stories of people that were having an episode of like a psychotic break, and it just escalated out of control. And that's another thing that desperately needs to change. So this is a little chart that shows all the many different factors that affect our mental health. So things like environment, relationships, physical health, genetics, substance use, diet, stress, trauma. And the thing I like about this particular graphic is that if you take that little pink bubble where it says physical health and you replace that with mental health, these would be all of the same factors that impact our physical health. And so, we often just separate mental and physical health completely, but we're one organism, and the same things that impact us physically can impact us mentally and vice versa. So this slide just shows that 67% of adults in the US believe that they have had a mental health condition at some point in their life. And I think a lot of times we think a person is either mentally healthy or mentally ill. And that's not always the case. A mental illness does not have to be a life sentence. And it's important to know that we can experience a mental health issue at any point in time in our lives, and just be aware of that. So now I want to talk a little bit about what I've learned about suicide. And the first is the terminology that we use. So we shouldn't say that someone committed suicide. Instead, we should say they died by suicide. And that's because the word committed has negative connotations. The word committed is often used to describe illegal or immoral acts. Things like committed adultery, committed a crime, committed a murder. And suicide is a tragedy. It is not a crime. It is not illegal or immoral behavior. And so the way that we talk about suicide is really important. And I didn't know this prior to losing Max. I didn't know the correct terminology, but it's gotten to the point where when I hear somebody say that they know a person who committed suicide, it's jarring to hear because it just sounds like they're the perpetrator of a crime, and that is not the case. So it's important to understand that suicide is a tragedy, not a scandal. Depressed people need help, not shame, not avoidance. And it just goes to show that the difference in the way that we view and treat mental illness and the stigma that is still attached to suicide. So since Max died, we have become involved with AFSP, which is the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and we've participated in several of their Out of the Darkness walks. If you're not familiar with these, they are held annually in really all parts of the country. Most places have an AFSP chapter. And the Out of the Darkness walks are to raise awareness about the prevalence of suicide and to bring people that have been touched by it together. And I will just say it is both sobering and comforting to participate in these walks to see how many people have indeed been touched by suicide. You also might know that a couple of years ago, the 988 hotline was implemented, and that is in place of a long 188 number. So it's nice that we now have a number like 911 that can be called in a crisis. And that is both like a call as well as a text line. And finally, you might be aware that the semicolon is sort of the symbol of the suicide prevention movement. And that's because a semicolon doesn't end a sentence. It's just a pause, and then a continuation of the sentence happens after. And the same can be true of somebody who is having suicidal thoughts. They can take a pause and get help, and then their life can continue. So now I'm going to talk about grief. So prior to losing Max, I had lost a couple of grandparents, but it was, the natural order of things. And so as a result, I was completely unprepared for and overwhelmed and just come with my grief. And so I needed to learn about grief, and it was a very long road to do that. But one of the things that I've learned is that grief is love with nowhere to go. So when Max died, my love for him didn't die. I still had all that. I still have all that love in my heart. I will always have that love for him in my heart. But he was no longer here to love. So I couldn't hug him. I couldn't kiss him. I couldn't call him. You know, he couldn't be there for holidays anymore. And so I needed to figure out, and I think it's going to be a lifelong lesson, what to do with the love that I still have for him. And oftentimes, the love that we have is equal to the grief that we feel, because when we lose someone so beloved, it just causes immense pain. Our culture treats grief like a problem to be solved, and grief is not a problem to be solved. It can't be fixed. We can't be cheered up. We just need people to experience it with us. And that's hard for many people to do because they don't like to see us in pain. But what we need is for people to come alongside us and walk beside us and not try to minimize it or rationalize it or any of the things that people tend to do with those that are grieving. So the stages of grief, you might be familiar with them: shock, anger, denial, acceptance. I'm forgetting one, but I remember when I learned about the stages of grief, I was so angry because I thought they were linear. And I thought it was 5 simple steps to getting over your grief. And that was never the way they were intended to be applied. And you don't go through one stage and then progress to the next and so on. You cycle back through, particularly the anger and the depression, until you get to acceptance. And oftentimes you can cycle through them in a day, in an hour, but you certainly cycle through over and over and over as you're grieving. So I like this graphic because it illustrates that. It's not distinct stages, separate in a line. It's all jumbled together. What is acceptance? So acceptance is the last stage. I'm gonna talk a little bit more about this in a second, but acceptance is the last stage in the original 5 stages of grief. And I remember when I first heard about accepting Max's death, I said, what does acceptance of my son's death even look like? I'll never accept his death. And it wasn't until I realized that acceptance was simply acknowledging the reality that I was able to really kind of move past that, because I was stuck, just like this graphic shows, on this left side. I was so angry he was gone. It was so unfair that he was gone. It was so tragic that his life was cut short that I couldn't acknowledge what was reality, what was right in front of me. And once I finally said, I hate this, I will never like it, I will never approve of it, but it's my reality, then I was really able to process my grief in a kind of a better and more a holistic way. So I personally think we should change the stages of grief label to cycles of grief, because as I talked about, we cycle through them over and over again and again. The other thing that I didn't know is that grief impacts a person emotionally, mentally, and physically. I honestly thought that grief was all mental or emotional. And it wasn't until I started to experience physical symptoms of my grief that I understood that it impacts the whole person. I would have, my heart would race. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. My stomach was always upset. And so it's really important for us to understand that grief does impact a whole person. It's not all in our head. David Kessler is, I think he's the preeminent grief expert in our country, and he puts out a lot of great material about grief. And I love this because he says, when do you stop grieving? Is it after 1 year? Nope. After 5 years? Nope. After 10 years? Nope. You never stop grieving. Now, over time, your grief does get easier to carry, or should get easier to carry. But I will grieve Max until the day that I die, because he was my son. I love him and I'll always love him. So it's, I'm not going to get to the point where I'll be like, okay, I'm done with that grief. I'm over that. That will never happen. So I'm a person of faith, and my faith has been important in my processing my grief. But this is a Bible verse, and I think it illustrates how we should come alongside people who are grieving. So it says, rejoice with those who rejoice, sharing in each other's joy, and weep with those who weep, sharing in each other's grief. And so I think this provides a roadmap. When someone is grieving, we shouldn't try to fix them. We shouldn't try to cheer them up. We shouldn't try to minimize, ignore, rationalize, or worst of all, spiritualize their loss. We should share in their grief. And as I mentioned earlier, that's hard to do. I know that the depths of my pain was so difficult for my friends and family to see, to witness, that oftentimes they tried anything to make me feel better. And there was nothing to be done. There was nothing that they could do. And so I just needed people who were going to sit with me and who were going to be with me, who I knew that I could count on. So I think this is a good reminder of how to handle the grief of others. So I've heard that when someone is going through a trial, the best thing to do is show up and shut up. And I think this is kind of a pithy way of saying that a lot of the platitudes that are common after we lose someone are not helpful. As a matter of fact, they're hurtful. So things like, he's in a better place. At least he's no longer suffering. At least you had him for 25 years. God needed another angel. God won't give you more than you can handle. Everything happens for a reason. None of those comments were helpful after we lost Max. And some of them made me so very, very angry. So again, we just need people to come alongside us and love us, not try to say something that's going to fix it, because there's nothing to say. There's nothing that can be said to a parent who has lost a child, or really anyone who's lost a loved one, that's going to make them feel better. So grief is work. Avoiding grief is even more work. You know, a lot of grief is so painful, and a lot of people try to stuff it. They try to ignore it. They try to distract themselves from it. And that doesn't work. Eventually, the grief will demand to be felt. And often, if that's the case, it comes out sideways. It comes out in unhealthy and unproductive ways. So it's really important that we process our grief so that we can work through it in a productive and in a healthy way. So I mentioned I'm a person of faith, and my faith has really been shaken by our loss. You know, Max struggled for a long time, and I prayed for him every day. And he was on the prayer list of many other people. We had prayer gatherings in our home to pray for him. And I remember walking through my neighborhood and really feeling like the Lord said to me, he's going to be okay. So I thought that meant he was going to be okay here. And so when Max died, I felt like the rug had just been ripped out from under me. And I was so angry. I felt betrayed. I felt abandoned. And I was just really angry with God. And that is a very common response to grief for people of faith. One of the things that our pastors did when they came to our home the morning that Max died was they told me, God can handle anything you throw at him. He can handle your doubts, your questions, your anger, your apathy, whatever. And I was very thankful for that. And this Bible verse really illustrates how I process my anger. You know, therefore I will not keep silent. I will speak out in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. And I did that. I really railed against God for a long time. And I was so thankful that I had that permission from, you know, faith leaders that I knew and trusted, that I didn't try to ignore what I was feeling. I was acknowledging it and I was letting it out. And I'm grateful that I had that, again, that permission to do so. Now, over the years, I have definitely felt Jesus pulling me closer. And when I look back over the 4.5 years since I lost Max, I see more God moments than I can possibly count. And I didn't see them at the time, but in retrospect, I see all the ways that God provided for me and was there for me and has just been with me all along. And that is now a source of great comfort for me. I want to share some tips I've learned along the way of things that have helped me in my grief journey and may help you. And the first is therapy. I had a therapist that I was seeing prior to losing Max, and I've continued to see her in the years since losing him. And she has been invaluable. Just having an objective third party to talk through things with has just been a lifesaver. You know, Bill and I needed marriage counseling. We needed marriage counseling when Max was struggling because having a child who's sick is very difficult on a relationship. And again, we have continued to see that marriage counselor from time to time. And again, invaluable, really helpful. Support groups. I can't say enough about support groups. We didn't know we needed a support group until about a year after losing Max. And I think I thought that if I could make it through that first year, I would be good to go. And when that year anniversary came and went, and not only did I not feel better, but in some ways felt worse, it was a very dark time. You know, that first year you're getting through the first anniversary, the first birthday, the first holidays. And then when you start the second year, you're just staring down at forever without your loved one. And it was such a dark time for me, for my husband Bill, for our other son Sam. And so we found a support group. It was a suicide survivor support group that has been a game changer for us. And I cannot speak enough about the value of support groups. To be with other people who have experienced the same kind of loss is so validating and normalizing that after the first session of that support group, I wept. So I can't say enough about support groups. The other thing is I needed medication. I needed to go on an antidepressant myself after losing Max. And that is not a sign of weakness. It's a tool that we have, and I needed it. I didn't need it for long, but I think that it can be very helpful when you're in those early, deep, dark days of grief. The other thing that I found incredibly helpful were creative outlets, and two in particular were journaling. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but I started journaling that summer after Max died as a way to process my swirling thoughts and feelings. And I couldn't sometimes name what I was feeling until I got it down on paper. And that was really helpful for me. And then the other thing that we did is we installed a Max Memorial Garden on our property. You know, oftentimes after a loved one dies, people give you a tree or a shrub or something. And we got a bench, we got that beautiful little garden pole that's sitting next to the bench that you can see. We got a tree, we got a memorial stone. And so installing that garden was something physical to do with my grief, and it was really helpful in processing it. So creative outlets, I think, can be hugely beneficial in processing grief. You know, the other thing that is really tempting to do is to numb our feelings because they're so intense, they're so painful, they're so overwhelming. And there's no shortage of things to numb with. You know, obviously the big ones like food and drugs and alcohol, but then busyness, TV, shopping. There's all sorts of ways that we can numb our feelings, but that only works for a short period of time because again, that grief is going to demand to be felt. And then the last one is to reframe expectations for yourself and for others. So I mentioned earlier that I had set this like arbitrary deadline of 1 year. Like if I can just make it through the first year, I'll feel better. And I set myself up for failure because I wasn't better. In some cases, as I said, I was worse. And it's also important to reframe expectations for others. You know, I remember friends saying to me, "We just want you back. We just want the old you back." And when they first started saying that to me, I I didn't understand. I understood what they meant. I didn't understand the feeling that it was eliciting inside of me, but the kind of loss that we experienced has changed us forever. And so my friends are never getting the old me back. The old me is gone because I have to now navigate life without one of my children. And so I'm forever changed by that. And so we have to help people around us understand that grief does change us. And, you know, it has been the hardest thing that I've ever experienced. And it has also given me my new life's mission, my new life's work is to talk to people like you about my beautiful boy, Max, about mental health, about suicide awareness, and about grief. And I'm very thankful for that. But I never imagined in a million years, 6 or 7 or 8 years ago, that this is what I would be doing at this point in my life. So those are some tips that have helped me, and maybe one of them will help you. So I mentioned the journaling that I did, and ultimately those journal entries I compiled into a book titled My Unexpected Journey, Reflections After Losing My Son to Suicide. The summer after Max died, I read everything I could get my hands on, and some of it was helpful and some of it wasn't, but none of it was visually appealing. And so when I decided, and I never really set out to write a book, it just sort of evolved. But when I decided that I was going to take these journal entries and compile them into a book, I thought I want to balance this really heavy content with some beauty. And so I found a graphic designer and an illustrator, and Sarah Nelson. She's incredibly talented. And she did 6 original illustrations of a bird that appear throughout my book. And the reason for the bird is that in the first days and weeks following Max's death, I kept seeing the same bird over and over. And as Sarah read my first few journal entries, she thought that the bird would be the perfect image to share throughout the book, because people often get signs in the form of a bird or a butterfly, sometimes a dragonfly. And so the illustrations that appear throughout the book just really balance the heavy content and make it beautiful. And she also took all of our family photos and laid them out in these really beautiful scrapbook spreads that just is so visually appealing. So I'm very proud of the resource that we have created, Sarah and I, and it's a resource for people that are grieving, obviously a death by suicide, but also for parents who have lost a child in any way. I think all child loss is traumatic and tragic. I've also heard it's very helpful for people who are walking alongside the grieving, because it's a very raw and vulnerable look into a grieving mother's heart. And I've also gotten feedback from clinicians that it helps them understand the grief process better in their clients. So again, very proud of this resource that we've created. One of the things that I've also done is I have become a grief educator since losing my Max, and I offer online grief groups for bereaved parents. And it is just so gratifying to come alongside these parents who are newly bereaved and just help them realize that they can survive the very worst experience, their worst nightmare, that they can survive the death of their child. And that has been a big part of my healing as well. And then I'd like to invite you to follow me on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. If you want to scan that QR code, that will take you to my website. And my website has information about my book, ways to purchase it, my grief groups, if you know somebody who might be interested, my speaking engagements that I do. I do this presentation both via the web and also in person, and I've done it for various organizations. So please check me out and follow me on those social media platforms. And I just want to thank you so much for being here tonight and for listening to this presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we are going to start to think about the questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Erin. Yes, we're going to transition now to a Q&A. We're learning that the chat box has been disabled, so please use the question and answer feature. That's where we can see your questions. So feel free to type any thoughts or questions that you may have in there. Erin, we have a question to start, and the question is, how can you get someone help if they are resistant to help or feel they don't have a problem?
Yeah, that's hard.
This is tough.
I'm going to answer that from my personal experience, but as Maggie said, I am not a mental health provider or professional. So I think this is probably one of the most difficult issues when you have a loved one who struggles with a mental health issue. Max didn't resist treatment. He didn't resist medication. but he was looking for the magic pill. He thought he should be able to take a pill and feel better. And mental illness, like physical illness, is, to go back to that slide, it's influenced by a variety of factors. So he just wasn't taking good care of himself, was making poor lifestyle choices, and that adversely affected his mental health. But it's so very common that people are resistant to medication. I have heard from so many parents whose loved ones stopped taking medication because they didn't like the way that it made them feel. And then they would often have a mental health crisis. So it is very difficult. And I think what I would say that I wish I had done with Max is when he was having a depressive episode, I would try everything in my power to pull him out of the dark pit that he was in. And I have learned through my grief that I wasn't able to do that. Just like people weren't able to pull me out of my grief, I wasn't able to pull him out of his depression, but I tried. And I wish looking back that I had empathized with him more and told him that he could get through the situation. He could get through this depressive episode rather than trying to pull him out of it. So I think empathy and understanding and kindness go a long way when we're dealing with someone who is struggling with their mental health. But we can't force things, right? So, Maggie, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think resistance is very common when it comes to mental health. Erin, I loved your slides on acceptance. Boy, is that a tough thing in so many. Acceptance is so difficult in so many aspects. And I think with mental health or when someone is struggling, they're normally aware, and they know they're struggling. Other people around know they're struggling, and then yet finding that strength and courage and acceptance to seek help for the first time, we know is normally one of the most difficult steps. And I really echo, Erin, your sentiment of getting in the pit with them, sharing that you love them and that together there is no one right answer, but they're not alone in forging that path forward together. I think it's always important to know and be aware of the crisis resources in your community. If someone's safety is ever at risk, calling 911 is the best decision probably to make there. But yeah.
Thank you, Adrienne. Thank you for that question.
Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? Erin, I have a question. I know that we do live in a pretty grief illiterate world right now. And I love your work on really shedding light and education on how to be grief literate. And I think there's a lot of parents on this webinar tonight. And I'm wondering if you can share any tips or tricks about grief literacy that people could take with them.
Yeah, I think if you're grieving, I think the best thing you can do is, if you're able, is to share what you need. So, if somebody is coming alongside you and they're offering those unhelpful or hurtful platitudes that I mentioned earlier, that, everything happens for a reason, and, other nonsense like that, is just to say to them, I know you mean well. I just need you to be with me. I just need you to sit with me. There's nothing to say that's going to make the situation any better. So I think, and that's hard, and that's particularly hard when we're in those early days of grief. I mean, I know when people would say things to me in the first, probably, frankly, the first 6 months, sometimes I would get so angry at what they said, and I didn't know why. I didn't know why I was having that response. But according to experts, the number one need of those that are grieving is to have their pain witnessed, not minimized, not ignored, not rationalized, not spiritualized, just witnessed. And that's why we all know grievers who have lost a loved one who continue to tell their story, month after month, year after year. And a lot of times those people do that because nobody has ever witnessed their pain. So unconsciously they're thinking, I need to keep sharing this story until I get the response that's going to be validating for me. And a lot of times they don't get that because, again, and it comes from a place of love. People are uncomfortable to see us in such a deep, dark place with our grief. But that's what grief is. Grief is love with nowhere to go. It's those feelings of intense loss. And of course it's going to impact the person. And you can't tell enough jokes to cheer them up. It just doesn't work. So, I think education is so important. And so, what I'm trying to do with my grief educator work is come alongside bereaved parents and help them feel less alone and better understood. And also help people that are walking alongside the grieving understand what's really helpful and what's so those are kind of those are the two prongs of my grief work.
That is such great work. It is so needed and so valuable, Erin. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We value your feedback and would love to hear your thoughts on this webinar, as well as suggestions for future topics. So if you can, feel free to take a moment to scan the QR code and complete our brief survey. And as a special thank you, Erin has generously donated a copy of her book. So I'm going to select a winner here. I have everyone's name in this little basket, and we'll be able to contact you. We have everyone's email to arrange delivery for the book. But let's see, I picked a name here. Awesome. So I hope I pronounced this name right. Is it Mora? Yeah? Okay. Maura, you are the winner of our book tonight. So I'll be in touch with you to make sure that can get delivered. Well, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. And thank you so much, Erin, for sharing your story and educating us on grief, loss, and suicide this evening.
Thank you for having me, Maggie. It was really my pleasure to be here. Together we can make some changes. We can make a difference.
Yes, definitely.
All right. Thank you. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.